There always have been pigs on this. Ever since I remember, there are always pigs here. Huge ones. We're going to get a little bit of a closer shot because we have a car parked in there. Yeah, that's that. Yeah. Yeah. Can I start now? Well, I just want to point out every village in Germany has a war memorial, and this is the First World War, 1914, and 2 of your father's brothers had died in that war, and we have their names down here. Willie Peterson and Alvin Peterson, and those were the 2 oldest brothers of your grandfather, and they had never returned to the village, and they were 2 very handsome young men just leaving their lives and never coming back. But I'm kind of glad we found their names down here. I was wondering myself, I've never discovered them before. That's the funny part. I grew up here and never looked if they're on this plate, and there they are, you know, which amazes me. And I'm kind of glad you came to trace them. Yeah, I'm really, you had the interest to find out about your grandfather's background, and here I discovered something for myself. I think that's great.
Go ahead.
Can you see the roofing over this direction? That's the garden of your grandfather's home, and we used to walk through that garden, past that bus, into the center of the village, and those, we call this, the trees themselves in the circle. This is the proudest part of Dersau. We've always been proud of the center itself. We call that the Dorfplatz. The Dorfplatz, it's more or less a gathering place. Years ago, I suppose the people have been more gathering there to be, when they had village fairs, they would start out, especially when they had village fairs with the horses, I remember. They would start in the center of this village and be riding either to the place of games or to be touring through the village itself. And Well, it's more or less whenever I think of Dersau itself, and I suppose your grandfather felt the same way, that the Dorfplatz is something you remember the most. And then past the Dorfplatz is the walk down to the lake. That was the most important thing, the lake. We enjoyed the lake the most. It was nothing else more important than going swimming in the summer. And I hope and I gather your father, your grandfather, my father went swimming there too. When I grew up, that was the most fun with my brother to go swimming to the lake. So we'll...
Okay.
And my stepmother's in the garden. You have a natural pearl shop. No, it's a surprise in there. You should see that.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Coming from the village, you would enter the property from there, and these big trees, they must have been planted when your grandfather was a child, because he remembers his grandfather planting them, and they're so big. But this one has must have been removed. There's a new one, but the old trees, it's always like when you're seeing these trees, you think of the farm with the main entrance in front. They restored it later years. They made a window out of it, but I think it has the main entrance was in front, and you'd be coming up with the horses and carriages and be stopping here to get off the horse and get off the carriage and be walking into the house. Well, the house, you would say it had an open fire. They didn't have stoves those days. And this was all open, and yet they'd be hanging their meats on from the roof, and there'd be smoke in the whole house. And it was a luxury later on to get stoves. But your great-grandmother cooked over an open fire. They had just the bedrooms, apart from this big room, to be sleeping of. But outside of that, they'd be living within this smoke that preserved the meat for the winter. They killed their pigs themselves, and they had prepared sausage and all kinds of things. There were ham. That this way they have meats and things to eat in the winter time. It wasn't like we're doing nowadays. They're putting it to the freezer. They had to restore it a different way, and that was to be hanging it in the smoke. And this was horrid. You can imagine walking into a house full of smoke, but it was almost it was natural. It was normal. You know, they'd be sitting there, and the fire would be open, and everybody would come and gathering around this fire, and she'd be cooking a big pot of meal once a week. And Erna told me, like, she wouldn't be fussing every day cooking a new meal. She'd be cooking having a big pot of something hanging over the fire and be cooking once a week, and they'd be reheating it as the week went on. You can imagine what a variety of changes in the food. In the meantime, then you'll be walking up to this big stable where they kept the storing of the hay and the straw for the animals, for the cows and for the horses. And I remember him telling me doing this kind of work all by himself in the meantime, it needed restoring and they're rebuilding it. But the original was made by your grandfather. And it's kind of sad to see it gone now.
What was the roof made out of? What did it look
Tar.
like? Tar?
Yeah, tar. And well, they had to retar it almost every couple of years so it wouldn't dry out. So, and I remember horses standing in there and cows standing in there. And for us, it was always the biggest stable around. And later years, you found out your grandfather built that stable. I had not known throughout the childhood that he was the one who built it. You know, that's something he told me later, visiting Germany. Well, this, I don't remember if they had this before, you know, this must have been. And, yeah, well, this is, originally that was the barn for the cows, and on top there was the hay. I remember when I was a child, I was playing there. It was lots of fun. And when they were feeding the cows, we kids be climbing up there and throwing down the hay to the cows. It was kind of fun. And I suppose when your grandfather grew up, he did the same, because later years they changed it into a living area. You know, people that are living there now, that's my brother. He's got his kitchen there. And it hasn't been a stable for quite some years. And the roofing itself, I don't know if your grandfather remembers, but I suppose later years they had this put on, but it must have been looking more cozy when it had the straw on top. It's, well, it's been taken care of. It needs painting every couple of years. And as far as I remember, it was looked this way, but when we look at the picture from years ago, it had the straw. And it was kind of dangerous living in these type of houses, you know, whenever there was a lightning going on. Especially Dersau had a very bad location because the clouds wouldn't pass the lake. And this way, a lot of farmhouses burned down in those earlier years. And that's why this type of roofing was most dangerous. Nowadays, you couldn't pay for the insurance that it cost to have that type of roofing. That's how come they got more the other type later years. Well, and that's the backyard. It was all fenced in, and they always kept their pigs out there. And they'd be killing them when fall was coming on to have something to live on during the winter. And I'm kind of thinking my poor grandmother, she must have been just working all day, having a bunch of kids, not ever resting, and knowing, well, those days weren't as easygoing as it is now, but I suppose they had some peace of their own. And I always loved to go back here, even though I'd been living someplace more comfortable. It's been always special nice. And so. Show you something. Before you start filming, I want to show you something. This is an original German family. This is the size of a German family. That's Irma's mother, not this family. And the father and mother and children only. Can you imagine the size of them? 14 children, yeah. And they had the farm just out. This is the house here from the air. See that?
Put that on.
Oh, what am I going to tell you about this room?
Put it on.
I have no choice. Put it on. But I should put on some lipstick. How am I going to put this? Oh, now I see. Oh, I found it. Well, you're starting now?
Yeah.
All right. This is the best living room of the house. I told you about the smoky place in front. That was the kitchen. And then they had all a best living room. And this is this best living room. And over here, they got this small window. You see that? This is a window. This is a very important window because when the smoke was going on outside, people would walk in and they wouldn't recognize who'd been walking in. They were checking through that window to watch who was coming when they're sitting here, because they shouldn't be opening the door. The smoke would be coming into that living room. So naturally this wasn't so pleasant. And well, I suppose this is the original size of that room. I don't know if they changed any of it later years. Next to that room, you see, those must be the original doors. I'm sure of it. You see the framing? That's real old. And that's, as I was told, Aunt Bertha's room next to this living room. And that's where she lived with her 2 children for a while. And well, I gather they didn't use this much. They'd be sitting more in that smoky place, being nice and cozy and warm.
This
Ja.
is the kitchen here.
Du, Irma, du brauchst nicht extra noch hier. Wir hätten nach draußen. And the kitchen was nothing your grandmother knew, because there was the opening into that. It was the opening into the main room.
So
We
this
called, but no, the kitchen was built later when they had bought the house. They built a kitchen. The kitchen was not common to have. They didn't have kitchens. They called this in front, what I was telling you about the meat hanging up there and being hanging in the smoke. They called that the Diele. Every house had a Diele, and a Diele is something for everybody to gather and come in. And you know, the worst of it was to have the food on top of you, you know. Can't imagine, you know, this is like a smokehouse. You call it a smokehouse, but you'll be living in the smoke. That was the terrible part of it. I wouldn't want to live in that smokehouse. Maybe you should go and, I don't know if it's gonna be her bedroom, you know. It's a little bit embarrassing. Irma, hast du jetzt dein Schlafzimmer in dem Zimmer nebenbei? Dieses war das Original-Wohnzimmer. Und dann ist doch das Zimmer immer da gewesen, ne? This was not the size. This was just about this. They took was another bedroom. Can you imagine? I
So ein
couldn't.
ganz kleines Fenster.
With a little bit of a coupy
Und auch
window.
die Decken, die waren ja so
Oh.
hier rüber, ne?
Yeah. Da,
Über der Tür.
oh, the ceiling was lower than this.
So it was like
Just about there, yeah.
Yeah.
And they had like the hay and the straw on top. And you can imagine.
Das ist noch von dem ersten, so wie das.
Ja, habe ich auch gedacht, die Framing of these doors. Und das Fenster, das ist doch auch das Original, nicht?
Ja, ja.
Aber ich sagte, aber die Türen, die habt ihr mal eingesetzt später,
Nein,
nicht?
nein, diese Türen haben wir hier übernommen.
Die haben sie übernommen. Those are the original doors.
Diese beiden jedenfalls, ne? Die
Ja.
anderen Türen, ja.
Nee, aber dass ihr die immer noch habt, wenn man das überlegt. How low these windows are, because of that ceiling, you know, they had been putting it up. Naturally, they couldn't, these windows, das muss die Originalhöhe gewesen sein von den Fenstern. Das,
Ja,
nicht?
sicher, so hoch
That-
war ja auch das Dach.
Yeah, that's the original.
This was a bedroom back then or no?
Ja, war das nicht Berthas? hat Bertha hier nicht drin gewohnt, ich erinnere mich ja auch nicht mehr so.
Ja, sicher.
Yeah, and here thinks Bertha was staying here because ich weiß nicht, was das mal hervorgerufen hat, aber irgendwas, entweder Papa oder Onkel haben gesagt, dass der Schramm hier immer ins Fenster gestiegen. Der hat das Fenster wohl. you remember me telling you about Bertha, that the blacksmith was climbing into the window. That was the window. So they told me once, they had known, you know. Ich habe denen das erzählt von Tante Bertha, dass der Großvater, der die Wut gekriegt hat, das hat Onkel Hanne mir ja erzählt.
Ja.
Nicht? Ich wusste das von Papa, wusste ich ja auch so wenig, nicht? Was Onkel Hanne mir erzählt hat. Das habe ich ja natürlich alles so ein bisschen mehr behalten. Und dass er dann, und da hat er dann gesagt, ja, da hat er so eine Wut gekriegt, die Kinder haben wir noch drauf losgelegt.
Die waren schon da, ne?
Ja, und You could have seen this you remember when we went with the picnic basket? And it was just about, you were so lazy, all of you didn't want to walk much, and you have to do a lot of walking. Weißt du, als wir zum Freilichtmuseum